Hi, I'm Malcolm Torres, host of the Sea Stories and Science Fiction YouTube channel and podcast. And today I'd like to talk to you about an author. His name is Scott Sigler, and in particular one of his books, which is called Infected. There's two really main things I want to talk to you about. One is Scott Sigler himself, how he was podcasting his books originally in the early 2000s and is still podcasting them today. And then the second thing I want to talk to you about is the writing style in this book and in several of Sigler's other books, and how they were originally put out in podcast format, how that kind of influences the way these books are written and kind of how you experience them. Let's get into the beginning of this with Sigler himself. Now, in the early 2000s, podcasts were new. There weren't all these podcasts that you have today, and they were only on Apple. And this is actually the original iPod here. And if you wanted to listen to podcasts, you had to sync this up with your laptop and use the iTunes app. And you'd have to go find the podcasts that you wanted and download them. And there were quite a few podcasts then, but there weren't nearly as many as there are today. And Sigler was one of the original people who was putting out his audiobooks, or Podio books as they were called back then. And the interesting thing is that, you know, if you were driving, like commuting a lot back and forth to work, you got sick of listening to the radio, one of the things that you would do is you would try to find audiobooks on CDs or on cassette tapes. Like, for example, this Game of Thrones. This was just the original book, the first book in the series. And this is a whole set of CDs. And this was like $45 at Barnes & Noble. So you had your choice of you could either go to the library and get cassettes or CDs, check them out there. Sometimes they were scratched, they didn't work that well. You could buy them, they were very expensive. Or you could listen to the radio. And, you know, so all those options weren't that great. And then along comes Apple with this cool little iPod and podcasts. And, you know, some of the podcasts were like, you know, pretty basic, but there were three at that time that I thought were just really different and really game changing. One was called Seventh Son, and it was a trilogy by a guy named J.C. Hutchins, which is really cool. I think you can still go out there and get that today. It has to do with cloning and a presidential assassination, and really good thriller series. And another series that I was listening to at the time was called We're Alive, and it was a zombie apocalypse kind of radio show in episodes, and there were actually multiple characters on that, so each character was on there and they would kind of act it out like an old-time radio drama. And then the other one was Scott Sigler, and Scott was putting out his books. I think there was Earth Core, and there was another book called Infected, and there was a book called Nocturnal. And then this trilogy, the Infected trilogy, came along. And I felt that at that time, it was really interesting to kind of be listening to all those podcasts, because I felt like Sigler was really driving this huge change in the publishing industry. He was putting these out every week. And, you know, I mean, you got to kind of think about this. Today, it's so easy to create a podcast. I mean, you go to anchor.fm, you hit a button and start talking, and hit another button and you're producing a podcast and it goes online. Back in the early 2000s, that wasn't the case. I mean, Sigler has to write all these chapters and then record them and then produce them and edit them with some sound effects and breaks and things like that, and insert advertisements and then get them online. I don't know if he had producers and other technical wizards working with him to do that, but my impression was that he was kind of doing this single-handedly. And it was really interesting, and it was fun to be listening to the books, you know, at that time in the early 2000s when they were being produced. So the podcasting format is different than a printed book, right? A podcast needs to have a couple of characters, a few different characters in a scene. You need to have a very vivid scene with, you know, action taking place. You need to get the action rising and the plot of the whole overall story from one episode to the next. You need to get the action moving forward in like a little 45-minute piece. So maybe like a chapter or two or three short chapters in a 45-minute podcast, or like a 1 hour episode, let's say. And, here's Sigler. He's writing it, reading it, producing it, publishing it every week, plus getting sponsors and, doing the website and all that other stuff. Just really a renaissance man in getting all that done, right? And you're listening to the podcast every week, and you're looking forward to the next episode. So just that whole format was fascinating to see how that all kind of came together in the early 2000s. So now you take that and the podcast format and you look at the book, like a book like this. And when you go to read this book, you can see like, oh, wow, this was actually these episodes. You see that as you read, 10, 20, 30 pages, you're like, oh, wow, it's got the action, the rising action, the cliffhanger. And there's this whole series of cliffhangers that take place throughout the book. And you're like, oh, yeah, that's because in the podcast, you want to have a cliffhanger at the end of the episode because you want people to come back and listen to the next episode. And so you kind of see that. The other thing that I think is really fascinating is that when you're reading, when Scott Sigler's reading his episode of the podcast, he's got to make it really vivid and really impactful very quickly. And you see that as you're reading the book. Very crisp, very realistic, visual scenery that comes together very quickly. And then you have characters taking action. The characters are all very distinctly different because on a podcast, he's reading it to you. And there's no time on the podcast to have these long paragraphs of, inner dialogue for the characters and stuff. Although some of that, but not like an over, not too much of it, right? And the other thing is the voices. When he reads on the podcast, he's doing it by himself, and he's got a woman and a guy in the scene, and he's doing the dialogue back and forth, and he's changing his voice from a woman to a guy. And then when you read the book, you really see, like just reading it, you can't hear the woman's voice or the man's voice, but you can really see that his characters are very unique and different. They speak very differently. And that, I think that carries over from the podcast as well. And there's another aspect of the podcast that carries over is that in the book, I got to explain the plot a little bit. No spoilers though. There's this kind of infection that starts to spread amongst people in like the Ohio, Michigan kind of Midwest sort of area. And these people are getting infected. And then like the Center for Disease Control and the CIA start to find out about this. So you've got these detectives on the ground and they're scrambling around trying to figure out what's going on. And then you've got these individual people who are getting infected. But the problem is that when people get infected, they become murderers. They become raging murderers because these voices in their head start telling them to do stuff. And then the characters who get infected, they kind of go on a mission, like they're going somewhere. And that's where you start to learn about this. There's this kind of alien extraterrestrial component at work in the plot. I'm not going to give it away to you. So you got all those pieces going, and then you've got all the unique voices of the different characters. But one of the voices in the podcast is the voice of this infection inside the person who's infected. And it's like they're having these auditory hallucinations. So you get infected, and then this infection takes over, and you start to hear voices. And what you realize, the character doesn't realize it, but the reader realizes that these voices are these other people who are infected also. So if I'm infected, I start to hear voices, and it's the voices of some of the other people who are infected. And the way he does this in the book is he actually has the dialogue of the inner dialogue that they're having, the inner voice of this infection that you're having is actually called out in a completely different font. And it's this really kind of creepy looking kind of like font that he uses. So, you can see a lot of interesting things going on between the podcast, listening to it, and reading the book. And I've found it really enjoyable to listen to the book on a podcast and then read it. I don't do that very often I don't read books twice or really listen to it and read it. But in this case, I have, because I found that to be so interesting. So I wrap this up. Scott Sigler, great writer, came out really hard in the early 2000s, is still going today, podcasting his books. He's got many, many books out there, mainly sci-fi thrillers with with a lot of technological tie-ins, and he's also publishing these books with Crown Publishing and Del Rey Publishing. So a lot of opportunities to listen to his stuff or read his books. And even today, you go on YouTube, go on Twitter, he's out there, he's social networking constantly. He's doing collaborations with other great writers, and he's interviewing people online, and just a really fascinating guy. And then his books in and of themselves are very strongly plotted, great characterization, a lot of research into mining, space travel, sports, biology, gene splicing, cloning, a lot of like dystopian kind of environments, kind of deathmatch fighting, intergalactic football league. So yeah, Scott's got a just crazy hyper imagination. And if you're driving, if you have a long commute, I definitely recommend getting into his podcast. And the last thing I want to tell you is that Infected, this book, is part of a trilogy. And so in the trilogy, you've got Infected, Contagious, and Pandemic. 3 really good stories that round out and fill the bill for this 3-part series. Thanks for joining me. Again, I'm Malcolm Torres. This is the Sea Stories and Science Fiction YouTube channel. I also have a podcast with old style and new original sea stories and science fiction. And I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe and like and drop a comment down there. And I look forward to meeting up with you online. I'm on Facebook and Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn, Goodreads. So thank you for joining me. We'll see you next time.